Hello, thank you for watching this video. My name is Tim Frasier from St. Mary's University, and in this talk I hope to address the question of how should we think about reproduction in North Atlantic right whales. I think that everyone here recognizes that two main factors are limiting the recovery of this species. These are anthropogenic mortalities from entanglement in fishing gear and vessel strikes, as well as a reproductive rate that is well below their known potential. Although many people are looking into the reproductive problem, it seems like there is really only a collective concern about this issue in very extreme years, such as when no calves are born, or years when only a few calves are born. However, when the number of calves goes back up to, say, 10 or higher, this collective concern seems to wane, at least a little bit. Over the years, this has really made me wonder, how do we know when we've had a good calving year, and how do we know when we've had a bad calving year? For example, was this past year a good year because there were 18 calves? I'd argue that right now we don't actually have a good scientific way to evaluate this. Instead, we tend to compare each year to the previous years. For example, we get worried when the number of calves is much lower than in previous years, and we celebrate when the number of calves is much higher than in previous years. However, if reproduction has been compromised since studies began, which seems likely, then this comparison is flawed. This leaves us with a poor understanding of the scale of the reproductive problem and the degree to which it is limiting the recovery of the species. With the case of anthropogenic mortality, there is a scientific and well-accepted process to identify the number of human-caused mortalities that can occur while still allowing the population to recover. This is the PBR, or the potential biological removal. This allows us to set clear and science-based targets for anthropogenic mortalities. In this way, whether or not it has been a good or a bad year for mortalities can be objectively determined by comparison to this target. However, I'd argue that we don't currently have an approach to set clear targets or expectations for reproduction that is scientific and objective, and proposing such a method is what I would like to do today. Before we can come up with an appropriate target, it is worth spending some time thinking about what the reproductive problem looks like. As I see it, it is manifested in two major ways. First, we have a large percentage of nulliparous females, or females that have not reproduced at all. Second, for those females that have reproduced, we see a relatively high frequency of longer interbirth intervals, as well as large variation around these intervals. I think that in our assessment of trends in reproduction over time, and in evaluating reproduction from one year to the next, we have primarily focused on interbirth intervals, but that this only captures a small part of the problem. For example, this is the reproduction section from the 2020 report card. We can see that details are provided on interbirth intervals. We can also see that the percentage of females available to calve who actually gave birth is also presented. While this is very informative, if we look at how this is calculated, it defines available cows as females that have given birth at least once. Therefore, none of these calculations include information on the nulliparous females, and therefore are not capturing the whole reproductive problem. To get a feel for how many females we might be talking about that fall into these different categories, we can take a cross-section of adult females for a specific year. Here I have done this for 2017, which is the most recent year for which I have data, although I hope to update this with more recent data soon. In 2017, there were 192 adult females that were alive. Of these females, 127 had been adults for greater than or equal to 10 years. Again, this does not mean that they had just been alive for 10 years, but rather that they had been adults for at least 10 years. If we take a look at the reproductive history of these females, we see that 74 of them, or 58%, had never given birth, at least by 2017. 6 of these females, or 5%, had had only one calf, and 47 of these females, or 37%, had had more than one calf. This means that data on interbirth intervals only captures information for about 1/3 of the adult females in a given year. This also means that the data used for calculating the available cows only captures information for about 42% of these females. What is perhaps most striking when you look at the data in this way is that the nulliparous females, which make up the majority of adult females in a given year, are not currently considered in any of the current methods that we use to track and evaluate reproductive success, even though, based on this information, it appears that they arguably represent the largest component of the reproductive problem. What we need then is a way to quantify reproduction and the reproductive problem in a way that captures all of these issues. A good starting point is the fact that we know that North Atlantic right whale females are capable of giving birth once every 3 years. In fact, many females frequently have a 3-year interbirth interval. What this means is that if it wasn't for the reproductive problems that we see, then we should be seeing about 1/3 of the adult females reproducing each year. And this, I propose, is a good metric for us to compare observed reproductive rates to. To try to visualize this, again, for each year we can calculate the expected number of calves if there were not any reproductive problems, as 1/3 of the adult females. Our observed number of calves will undoubtedly often be below this. However, in this case, this difference accounts for both of the major components of the reproductive issues. For example, nulliparous females will obviously contribute to this difference because they will represent adult females that do not reproduce and therefore result in the observed number of calves being less than expected. When females have interbirth intervals that are longer than 3 years, then this will also contribute to the difference between the observed and expected number of calves because it will result in fewer adult females giving birth in their expected years, although this could average out over time. Therefore, I would argue that this approach captures both important components of the reproductive problem and therefore represents a more appropriate metric and reference that can be used for assessing and monitoring the reproductive problem over time. I should emphasize that this idea is not original and has been applied to many species, including North Atlantic right whales in the past. For example, this paper conducted the same calculations, referring to it as calves per mature female per year, or CMFY. However, there was a potential for this metric to be biased in the early years of this study because it takes a long time for us to know if a female is mature, particularly if she does not reproduce. So there is always a potential for our estimate of the number of mature females to be biased downwards. But this should be less of a problem in the later years of the dataset. To see what this looks like, we can again use 2017 as an example. Again, in 2017 there were 192 adult females alive, and therefore we should expect roughly 64 calves to be born. However, in this year, only 5 calves were born, which is roughly only about 8% of the expected number. Granted, 2017 was a particularly lean year for calves, so we can look at these observed versus expected values over time. Before we do that, we can make our expected calculations slightly more realistic by allowing for stochastic variability. There are a number of ways that we could do this, but one way is to use a binomial distribution, where the probability of reproducing is 1/3, or 0.33, and our number of trials is the number of adult females alive in each year. Here are the expected number of calves in each year from 1990 through 2017, along with their 95% confidence intervals in black, and the observed number of calves for each year are in red. We can see that the species has not reached even the lower boundary of the confidence interval for any year, even in those years where we thought the calf numbers were very good. Under this scenario, any year that the calf numbers fall within the confidence interval of these expected values would be a good year, whereas years in which the number of calves is below this expected number indicate years in which reproduction is compromised by one or more of the factors discussed. Of course, this does not mean that we should not be happy in years where the calf numbers are higher than usual, but it does provide an important context for interpreting those calf numbers, which, although they may be higher than the average, are still well below what we would expect to see in this species if reproduction was not being compromised. We can also look at the difference between these observed and expected values over time as the percentage of the expected number of calves that were actually born. Although there is a lot of variability, we can see that, averaging across all years, the number of calves born is roughly 30% of those that are expected. Another way to interpret this is that, over the long run, the reproductive rate of this species is only about 1/3 of its known potential. Based on this idea, I propose that we assess and monitor reproduction based on comparisons of these theoretical expectations. I see it being similar to those fundraising graphics, where each year we can use the number of adult females that are alive to calculate the expected number of calves, We then have a clear target against which we can compare the observed number of calves. I'm sure that some of you are wondering, if we know they are going to fall short, why is coming up with such a metric so important? I think that there are at least two main reasons. The first is that I think many of us are interested in untangling the relative role of mortalities and poor reproduction on the recovery potential of the species. However, if we are going to do this, we need to quantify each of these appropriately. I don't think that we are currently quantifying the reproductive problem appropriately, and this is resulting in an undervaluation of the impact low reproductive success is having on species viability. For example, it would be interesting to project what the trends might look like if all of these expected calves were born into the population. Comparing these projections with observed trends would allow for an objective quantification of the degree to which low reproduction is limiting population growth. Second, many of us are trying to understand what factors are influencing reproductive performance. Some hypotheses include food availability, stress, and inbreeding. However, if we want to quantify the effects of these factors on reproduction, we first must have an appropriate quantification of the problem itself. My hope is that this approach will provide a more appropriate quantification of the reproductive problem that will help everyone trying to understand this issue better. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.